She held me like the world had shrunk to just us. And in that moment, I realized some connections don't wait for permission. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually passes unnoticed. I had ducked into the corner cafe to escape the drizzle outside, the smell of roasted coffee beans and damp pavement mixing in the air. I was halfway through pretending to read a book when she walked in. She wasn't the type to announce herself. There was no dramatic flair, no sudden presence. Just a calm grace that seemed to make the room slow down for a second. She looked to be in her early 40s, 40 exactly, I would later realize, and carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of knowing who you are. Her long black hair framed her face, soft waves brushing against her shoulders, and her eyes, dark brown and observant, scanned the cafe with an almost meditative focus. She ordered her coffee quietly, her voice measured, and then turned to find a seat. Our eyes met, briefly at first, and something about her gaze made me feel as if she had known me longer than mere minutes. It wasn't curiosity or judgment, it was recognition, a subtle acknowledgement, like she had already anticipated this moment somewhere deep in her mind. I found myself unable to focus on my book. My attention kept drifting toward her. The way her fingers gently adjusted a stray strand of hair, how she tucked herself into the corner by the window, the faint smile she offered to the barista when her drink arrived. Everything about her movements felt deliberate, yet unhurried, as if she were walking through her own rhythm that I had no right to disturb. And then she looked up again. This time, the look lasted a second longer. Her eyes softened, and I could have sworn there was a flicker of something unspoken. An invitation, though not of words, of presence. I shifted in my chair, pretending to read, but my mind raced. I felt a peculiar mix of nervous anticipation and calm curiosity, like standing on the edge of a story that had already begun somewhere else. She settled into her seat, pulling out a notebook. I could see her writing something, though I couldn't make out the words. There was a faint floral scent that seemed to linger around her, subtle but comforting, and it mixed with the warm aroma of coffee in a way that made the cafe feel unusually intimate. A soft light from the overcast sky filtered through the window, casting gentle shadows that highlighted the graceful line of her jaw and the quiet steadiness in her posture. I could feel the pulse of my own heart in my chest, a steady thrum against the hush of the cafe. Then, almost imperceptibly, she smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips, not for me, but at me. And in that moment, I realized this encounter wasn't ordinary at all. It was a story that had begun before I arrived, and for the first time, I was part of it. The world outside continued its quiet hum, the rain tapping lightly against the glass, but inside, time had paused. I was here, and she was here, and for just a fleeting moment, nothing else mattered. I went back to the cafe 2 days later. I told myself it was just for the coffee, but we both know that wasn't true. Some part of me had been waiting for her, hoping that the brief connection we shared would somehow repeat itself. And there she was, seated at the same window corner, her sketchbook open, though she wasn't drawing this time. She looked out at the street, as if the world had paused for her, and the sunlight streaming through the window made her long black hair shine with a subtle warmth. Her dark brown eyes flicked up at me, and for a moment she seemed surprised, then something like recognition softened her gaze. She gestured toward the empty chair across from her. I walked over, trying to appear casual, though my heart was a little too aware of every step. Sitting down, I noticed the faint curve of her shoulders as she leaned slightly toward the table, the gentle way her fingers rested on the edge of her notebook. "It's still empty," she said softly, voice calm and measured, carrying that quiet confidence I couldn't stop noticing. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Good. I didn't want to take the floor from anyone else." She laughed, not a polite, measured laugh, but one that felt full, carrying a warmth that seemed to sink right into the space between us. The sound was subtle, almost private, and it made me realize how long it had been since I'd felt at ease with someone I barely knew. We talked, at first about small things, the rain, the way the city looked after a storm, the cafe itself. Her words were deliberate, thoughtful, each sentence chosen carefully as though she wanted to say exactly what she meant and nothing more. I spoke about the book I had been reading, my own life's uncertainties, the things I hadn't shared with anyone else. She listened, really listened. Her eyes never left mine for long, and when they did, they seemed to carry a quiet reflection, as though she was considering every word I said with care. At one point, our hands rested near each other on the table, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the subtle warmth radiating from her skin. I noticed it, of course. She noticed it too, but neither of us moved. There was something unspoken in that proximity, a silent acknowledgement of the quiet tension between us. Hours passed like minutes. The cafe quieted around us, the faint strains of jazz in the background, the smell of coffee deepening, and the sunlight softening into late afternoon. She looked at the clock, then back at me, a small smile playing on her lips. "You've been here for hours," she said, teasing lightly. "Feels like minutes," I replied, smiling despite myself. She tilted her head, dark eyes narrowing playfully. "You're young. Time behaves differently for you." "Maybe," I said, "but right now I think it's behaving just fine." She smiled again, slower this time, and I felt it. Not longing, not sadness, just a quiet recognition. I knew then that she felt it too. This delicate, fragile thread stretching between us, a connection that neither of us yet had words for. For the next few days, I found myself replaying that afternoon over and over. Every glance, every small smile, every moment her hand rested near mine seemed to linger in my mind longer than it should have. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the thrill of meeting someone so unexpectedly magnetic. But deep down, I knew it wasn't imagination. It was something real, delicate, and precariously balanced. When we met again, something had shifted. She arrived later than usual, her stride purposeful but quieter than before. There was a slight tension in her shoulders, the subtle stiffening of someone who has learned caution over the years. Her expression was still warm, but there was a measured edge to it, as if she were carefully gauging how much of herself to share. I said, trying to keep my voice light, though my chest felt tighter than I expected. "Hi," she replied, and I noticed the slight hesitation in her smile. Not hesitation at me, exactly, but hesitation at letting the moment, at letting herself simply exist. We ordered our drinks and took our usual seats, but the conversation didn't flow like it had before. There were pauses, not awkward, but filled with a quiet weight. Her eyes would flit toward the window or the cafe door, subtle signs of a mind thinking about more than just our exchange. I caught myself studying the lines of her face, the faint laugh lines at the corners of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, and wondered what experiences had carved those lines, what story she carried behind them. I tried to speak about simple things, books, music, random observations about the city, but each time I sensed her filtering her responses, weighing her words. And maybe I did the same. There was a mutual awareness, an unspoken understanding that the gap between us wasn't just age or experience. It was the difference between someone still finding their place in life and someone who had already navigated so many of its twists. At one point, our hands brushed lightly as we both reached for the sugar container. I felt the heat of her skin, fleeting and electric, and I noticed her fingers lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. She didn't pull away abruptly, just let it pass, her dark eyes catching mine for a moment, a flicker of something unspoken moving between us. I realized then that the distance I felt wasn't a rejection. It was caution, careful, deliberate care. She was protecting herself as much as she was testing me, and I found myself respecting it even as it left me restless. When she finally spoke, it was quiet, almost to herself. "Sometimes I forget how young you are, how much you still have ahead of you." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Her words weren't critical. They were honest, gentle, and tinged with a bittersweet awareness. And in that silence, the cafe felt suddenly larger, brighter, more alive, as if the very air between us was charged with potential, fragile and waiting. By the time we parted that day, I realized that connection wasn't always measured by closeness or touch. Sometimes it was in the careful distance, in the tension that existed between hearts that were aware of each other, but still cautious. And for the first time, I understood that patience, like observation, was part of intimacy too. It was one of those evenings when the city felt quieter than usual, the air soft with the remnants of a fading sun. I hadn't planned to see her that day, but somehow my feet led me toward the park near the cafe, where we often lingered after our conversations. She was there already, sitting on the edge of a stone bench, a light scarf around her neck and her hands resting loosely in her lap. When she saw me, her expression softened, and I felt the familiar tug in my chest, the awareness that even in silence, she had a way of noticing me fully. I approached slowly, unsure if she wanted company, though the warmth in her gaze answered my unspoken question. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, though the question seemed almost redundant. "Not at all," she replied, shifting slightly to make room. The corners of her eyes crinkled with a quiet welcome. We didn't speak immediately. The park seemed to hold its breath around us, the gentle rustle of leaves blending with distant traffic, and for a moment, there was no need for words. She tilted her head slightly toward me, her long black hair catching the soft light, and I noticed how relaxed her shoulders were, a subtle invitation to presence, not conversation. Eventually, she spoke. "Do you ever feel like no matter how much you try, some parts of yourself stay hidden?" Her voice was gentle, almost hesitant, carrying a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I nodded slowly. "All the time. Maybe it's not hiding. Maybe it's just waiting for the right person to notice." Her lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that suggested relief, recognition, and a touch of amusement all at once. She shifted closer, just enough that the warmth of her arm brushed against mine. I felt my own pulse respond, not with longing, exactly, but with a quiet awareness of proximity, the subtle electricity of presence. "I wasn't sure I could tell anyone that," she admitted, voice low. "It feels fragile." "I understand," I whispered. "You can take your time. I'm here." She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at me. Her eyes glistened faintly in the dimming light, not with tears, but with honesty. There was a trust there, delicate yet undeniable, that made my chest tighten in a way words couldn't describe. The conversation wandered after that. Small confessions, stories from her life before the city, little hopes I hadn't known she held. We didn't try to fill every silence. In fact, the quiet became part of the dialogue. Each pause, each lingering glance, each small touch, a hand brushing mine as she adjusted her sleeve, a subtle lean toward my shoulder, carried weight far beyond ordinary gestures. By the time the sun had fully disappeared behind the skyline, the vulnerability we had shared had created a bridge between us. Not a bridge of declarations or grand gestures, but of understanding. I realized then that intimacy didn't have to be loud to be profound. Sometimes it thrived in the spaces between words, in the quiet acknowledgement of being fully seen. And as we stood to leave, I noticed her glance linger on mine, soft but steady, as if silently saying, "I trust you with this part of me." The days that followed our shared vulnerability in the park felt heavier, yet somehow more vibrant. Every time I saw her, even in passing, I noticed subtle shifts, the way she carried herself, the way her gaze seemed to linger a fraction longer on me, the quiet moments when she would smile softly, as if holding a secret she hadn't yet shared. We met again at the cafe on a warm afternoon. The sun poured through the wide windows, turning the wooden tables golden and illuminating the slight lines at the corners of her eyes. She sat in her usual corner, notebook open but untouched, her posture relaxed yet deliberate, as if she had chosen that precise position for a reason I could not yet fathom. I said, sliding into the chair opposite her. She glanced up, a small flicker of recognition lighting her dark brown eyes, and gave me a smile that carried both comfort and hesitation. "She said softly, voice calm and careful, yet threaded with warmth. The conversation began casually, brushing over books, weather, and minor city observations. But beneath each word was an unspoken layer, a tension, a curiosity, a longing neither of us dared to name aloud. I noticed the way her hand moved to brush a stray strand of hair behind her ear, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. The motion was innocent, yet it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. At one point, our hands came close on the table, fingertips almost brushing. I could feel the quiet heat radiating from her skin, and when our eyes met, there was a pause, a wordless acknowledgement of the connection that had been quietly building between us. Neither of us spoke, but the air between us seemed charged, humming with a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. She tilted her head, dark eyes narrowing playfully. "You make it difficult to remember where the lines are," she murmured, her voice a mix of amusement and caution. I swallowed, caught in the gravity of her gaze. "I don't know if I'm even aware of them," I admitted, voice low. There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, but full, weighty, and deliberate. The sunlight glinted off the rim of her coffee cup, highlighting the subtle curve of her lips and the graceful slope of her shoulders. I noticed how the quiet steadiness of her presence seemed to anchor me, even as my heart raced in anticipation. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward. Her arms didn't reach out, but the slight movement brought her closer, a careful closing of the space that seemed to say more than words could. I felt the warmth of her proximity, the faint scent of her perfume, and the subtle rhythm of her breathing. "I don't know if I should be here," she whispered, almost to herself. "Then maybe you should," I replied softly, my voice barely above the cafe's gentle hum. Her gaze met mine, steady and unflinching, and for the first time, the tension between us felt tangible. Not fear, not hesitation, but possibility. Possibility held in a single look, a single moment, a quiet confession neither of us had the courage to speak aloud. And in that pause, I realized something undeniable. Whatever this was between us, it had already begun. The next time I saw her, something felt different. The easy rhythm between us had shifted, not dramatically, but in subtle, unmistakable ways. She sat in her usual corner at the cafe, but there was a slight stiffness in her posture, a quiet wariness in her eyes. Her notebook lay closed on the table, untouched, and she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, the spoon tapping lightly against the cup. When she finally looked up, her gaze met mine, and for a fraction of a second, I thought she might look away, but she didn't. She held my eyes with a mixture of warmth and something I couldn't quite name. Hesitation, maybe, or worry. I said softly, sliding into the chair across from her. "Hi," she replied, voice even but distant, the usual ease between us replaced by a careful composure. I tried to bridge the gap with small talk, commenting on the weather, asking about her week, trying to create the familiar flow that had come so naturally before. But she answered in measured tones, thoughtful yet restrained, and I realized she was guarding something important. Finally, I stopped pretending. "Did I do something?" I asked gently, my fingers resting on the table, taut with anticipation. She drew a slow breath and looked down at her hands, clasped tightly around her coffee cup. When she spoke, it was quiet, hesitant. "No, you haven't done anything. It's just..." Her voice trailed off, and I waited, sensing the unspoken weight behind her words. "I've been thinking," she continued, lifting her eyes to meet mine again, "that maybe I shouldn't come here for a while." The words fell softly, but they struck hard. My chest tightened, a low ache settling in my ribs. I wanted to reach for her hand, to hold her there and tell her not to go, but I stayed still, letting the pause stretch between us. "Why?" I asked, voice low, careful not to push. Her gaze softened, but carried a hint of sorrow. "Because this feels like something it shouldn't. People will talk, and even if they don't, it's hard to ignore what it means." She hesitated, then added almost in a whisper, "You make it too easy to forget where I am in my life." I realized then that this wasn't about rejection. It wasn't about me. It was about fear, the fear of consequences, of judgment, of stepping into something that felt too significant to handle lightly. "I understand," I said gently. "Whatever you need, I respect it." She exhaled, a mixture of relief and regret crossing her features. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, she rose, gathering her things. Before leaving, she paused, hand resting on the back of her chair, and looked at me with an intensity that made my chest ache. "You're a good man," she said softly, "and that's part of the problem." I couldn't move fast enough to stop her, but I reached out instinctively, brushing my fingers lightly against her sleeve. She froze, eyes meeting mine one last time. "I don't know what this is," I said quietly, "but I know it matters." Her lips curved in a small, fleeting smile, her eyes shining with unspoken understanding. And then she walked away. The cafe felt emptier, the sunlight harsher, the air thinner. But in that absence, I realized something profound. This was not an ending. It was the moment before everything had to be faced, the fragile space where truth waited to be acknowledged. Weeks passed before our next meeting. I hadn't expected to see her so soon, yet here she was, entering the cafe like the sun had decided to follow her inside. The light caught her long black hair, giving it a soft shimmer, and highlighted the subtle lines around her dark brown eyes. Lines that spoke of laughter, wisdom, and a life fully lived. She wore a crisp white blouse and soft gray slacks, simple yet elegant, radiating a quiet confidence I'd come to recognize and admire. Our eyes met immediately, and I felt that familiar pull, the awareness that in this space for this moment, nothing else mattered. She approached the table and gestured to the seat opposite her. I rose, feeling my pulse quicken, though there was no need for words. The air between us was charged not with impatience or uncertainty, but with anticipation and relief. We sat down, and she opened her notebook, flipping through pages that held sketches and scattered notes. This time, she didn't write. Instead, she looked at me, and in that gaze, I felt a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of all the pauses, the hesitations, the shared silences that had brought us here. "I wasn't sure I'd come back," she said softly, voice carrying warmth and honesty. "But I miss this." Her hands rested near mine on the table, fingers close enough to brush, yet not moving, letting the proximity speak in place of words. "I miss this too," I admitted, my voice low. The sunlight streamed across the table, casting our hands in gentle light, highlighting the subtle warmth of her skin against mine. For a moment, we just sat there, letting the quiet settle around us. Outside, the city carried on, but inside, time seemed suspended. Her shoulder brushed mine lightly, and I felt the familiar, grounding rhythm of her presence. It was a simple touch, yet it held weight, a silent confession, a mutual understanding of what had been growing between us. She leaned slightly closer, her cheek resting lightly against my chest. The steady beat of her heartbeat echoed against mine, grounding me in a way words never could. I placed my hand over hers, a gentle, deliberate touch, careful yet unmistakably present. In that small gesture, the distance of days and fears collapsed, leaving only clarity. We belonged here, in this moment, together. "I used to think you'd already written our story," I said softly, almost to myself. Her eyes met mine with steady warmth. "I didn't know the ending," she replied. "I only knew it would be worth remembering." We lingered in that quiet intimacy, letting the sunlight and soft cafe hum fill the spaces between us. When she finally stood to leave, it wasn't a goodbye, it was a promise. Her hand pressed lightly against my shoulder, a gentle anchor, a wordless assurance that what we had found would continue, steady and unforced. I watched her leave, feeling the echo of her presence lingering in the air. And in that moment, I understood, some stories aren't written in grand gestures or declarations. They are written in small, deliberate moments of trust, warmth, and quiet love. And ours, fragile, patient, and beautifully imperfect, had found its place.